my name is Crystal and I'm a career coach at the University of Utah. I promise it's not weird that a coach from the University of Utah is giving a presentation on feedback. I did graduate from Purdue, so I have some ties to Tippecanoe County. Before we get started with the presentation, a couple of housekeeping things. Because of COVID-19, like most of you, I'm working from home. Welcome to my guest bedroom. But what that also means is I have my cats at home with me, and if one of them suddenly jumps in my lap, that could happen. Wanted to give you all a heads up. I also super strongly believe in interactive presentations, so if you want to go ahead and pull that chat box up, I'm going to be asking some questions and some things like that from you all that'll help this presentation go a little bit more smoothly, so go ahead and pull that up. And then at any point, if you have questions about the presentation, you can go ahead and drop them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation because we do have times for questions and answers. I think that's all the housekeeping things, so let's go ahead and get started. My agenda for today is to answer these 4 questions. How do I give and receive feedback properly? How can I seek out feedback? What if I receive feedback that I don't agree with? And how can I promote a culture of feedback at my workplace? So over the course of the presentation, my goal is to answer these 4 questions. But before we get to any of the real content, I want to do an activity that I like to call a single word sum up. So using one single word, sum up how you feel about feedback and drop your answers into the chat box so that I can see what you all are saying. And we'll take a couple minutes for that. Anxious, that's not uncommon. Relevant, nervous, informative. Constructive, terrifying, growth. It seems like we're kind of all over the place. Necessary, welcomed. Constructive, it can be. Good answer, Brittany. Yeah, so in my experience, feedback can be a whole spectrum of things, right? Like it can be on that terrifying scale, and then it can be on that constructive, helpful scale, and anywhere in between, right? So hopefully by the end of this presentation, some of you that are on the more anxious, terrifying side of the scale will feel a little bit more comfortable not only seeking out feedback, but giving feedback. To get us started, I found a video on YouTube that's going to help us figure out just kind of the basics on giving and receiving feedback. Before I play this video, it's going to say that it's 11 minutes long. I promise I'm not going to let it go for 11 minutes. And then afterwards, we're going to have some discussion about it. Let me change my screen share settings. All right.
Credit Suisse presents Management in a Nutshell. Today, feedback, or how blind spots become visible. Everything's going on as usual in the Spring Valley Bank, or so it would appear. Since Paul, the bank manager, has returned from his seminar on communication, however, he's been taking a much closer look at his colleagues. His attention falls upon James, his project manager in the back office, who often treats his in-house clients with a lack of sensitivity. His greetings are mostly unemotional. Now and again, he lets his colleagues wait, despite fixed appointments. He's also started giving in his work later and later. When one of the relationship managers then tells Paul that she feels she's been falsely advised by James, it's the last straw. Paul decides to confront his employee with his observations. Paul assumes that James will be reasonable. After all, he is a valuable employee despite some small weaknesses. But their discussion is anything but pleasant. After only a very short time, they face each other unrelenting. From the very beginning, they had launched into a downward spiral of accusation and justification. What went wrong? To answer that, we have to remember the difference between a person's self-perception versus an outsider's perception. Self-perception is the image one has of oneself, while an outsider's perception is how we appear to others. These two images are not always identical. When others tell us how they perceive us, they help us to improve our behavior. Thus, feedback means much more than just forcefully telling others our opinion. No, whoever gives feedback, whether boss or employee, must observe certain rules. For feedback isn't an attack. It's a gift. The person who gives feedback simply describes the behavior or action he has observed, as opposed to judging it. He forgoes conjecture and speculation and gives explicit examples. and treats the other with respect. And the feedback's recipient should not immediately assume a defensive position. The person who receives feedback does not defend himself, but first just listens. Should he get the feeling, however, that a personal boundary has been overstepped, he should say so. After their first failed attempt, Paul and James get together once more. Paul describes what he has observed, factually, accurately, and in a friendly manner. And James listens to him calmly, without immediately justifying himself. He's understood that the feedback means a chance for him to work on himself and his behavior. The effects of a functioning feedback culture in Spring Valley quickly make the rounds.
All right, let me change some settings really quick. All right, so what did y'all think of that video? And again, you can put your responses in the chat box. Was it helpful? Was it silly? Did you like the animation? Anything about how you felt about that video? Helpful? Okay, thank you, Lauren. We're liking the descriptions of feedback that the video gave, which, yeah, for sure. So y'all are kind of getting into the next bit. So what did you all learn from the video about giving feedback? What did they say was essential to giving feedback? And y'all have said a couple things. Objective, yeah. Facts, not judgments. Yeah, I definitely like no conjecture, just describing the behavior for sure. Respect, very important, Joelle. Anything else we learned about giving feedback? No is an acceptable answer. So just to kind of recap what the video said about giving feedback, it's not an attack. Giving feedback is a gift to the other person to help them grow, right? We describe the behavior and action explicitly. You don't assume things. There's no conjecture involved. You're just describing the behavior that you've observed, and you treat the other with respect, right? So exactly what you all said. What did you all learn on the receiving end from the video? Listen calmly, which can be very hard for some, and in some situations even. Don't be defensive, don't need to be defensive for sure. Yeah, definitely. You guys are kind of getting to the point about not being defensive right away. So don't automatically become defensive and listen first. You all are getting that exactly right. But that being said, just because you're on the receiving end of feedback doesn't necessarily mean that you have to just like sit there and take it, for lack of a better phrase, right? If you feel like things are being unfair or if some kind of boundary is being overstepped, it's 100% okay to voice that to the person that's giving you that feedback and kind of make that be known in the conversation for sure. The video gave us some good starting ground for giving and receiving feedback, and I'm glad you all kind of agreed with that assessment. But what it didn't do is it didn't give you step-by-step how to give and receive feedback. So what I'm gonna do now is give you like step-by-step, how do you give feedback and then how do you receive feedback. So on the giving feedback side, if you would like to give feedback to somebody else, and I know that a couple of you said this is kind of a formalized version of giving feedback, and that's true, but we're gonna get to a more casual approach a little bit later, is you first gather that data and those observations. So what are they doing? They being the person that you want to give feedback to that you'd like to comment on. Pick an appropriate time, place, location. If it's positive feedback, maybe it would be okay to do it in a larger group. If it's constructive feedback, maybe let's take it into a more personal, intimate setting so that you can have a more open conversation that's not for the public to see. Leading with your intent is always very important. As they said in the video, feedback is a gift, and you want to make sure that they know where you're coming from. I noticed this and I'm just trying to help out, or hey, I noticed this thing, can we talk about it? Or hey, I noticed your effort and I really want to make sure that you're recognized for it. Present your observations in a respectful way. The video talked about that. Asking them for their input or thoughts. So once you kind of present your case, for lack of a better phrase, asking them how they feel about it, asking them, do you have any questions about this, can kind of help it be a two-way conversation instead of you just, spilling all of the feedback onto them and expecting it to just be that one-sided conversation. And then finally, ensuring that they feel heard and understood. If it's a constructive feedback conversation or even a positive feedback conversation, making sure that they feel heard, understood, you all are leaving on a good note, and everything is good in the world, basically. Steps to receiving feedback, like you all said in the chat, be open to the feedback conversation. If you feel like it's going down that path, it's easy to become defensive really quick and assume that they don't know the whole story or something to that effect, but they don't have to give you feedback. They're going out of their way to do so. So being open-minded about what they're observing of your image versus your self-image can be an important first step. Listen completely before jumping in. Not everybody that feels inclined to give you feedback is going to be good at it, and it might take them kind of a roundabout way to get to their point. So make sure that they're done kind of talking about whatever the feedback is before you immediately jump in. Reflect on intent and context. They might not have the whole story for what they're giving feedback on. Remember that they're trying to help. That's why they're giving you that feedback. Ask clarifying questions. So if there's something that they said that you're not quite sure about, something to the effect of, when you said this, did you mean this? Can help kind of clarify where they're coming from and what they're trying to tell you, especially if they're not super great at the giving side of feedback. Thank them for their input. Again, they didn't have to give you feedback. They can go about their lives and just let things go, but they're trying to help. So thanking them for their time. And then knowing your limitations. I think this is an important step on receiving feedback, both on the constructive side and the positive side. Because I know if I receive constructive feedback that I wasn't necessarily expecting, then I might get a little bit combative about that, and just recognizing that within myself, I can make sure that I'm mitigating my defensive reactions. But even on the positive side, if someone is just showering me with compliments or telling me that I did an extra good job, I know that I get kind of weird and awkward, and just recognizing that in myself before I start minimizing my accomplishments and just saying thank you can also be really helpful for the conversation. Now, we talked about some foundations from the video. We talked about steps to giving and receiving feedback. But I have next a list of considerations that I think are also important to take into account when you're giving feedback or receiving feedback. The first is timing. I mentioned in the giving feedback, considering timing as far as like, who's there, where are you, things like that, but also timing in regards to like, how close to the observation or event that caused the feedback are you giving this? So if you are working in a team project and someone in your group said something that kind of ruffled your feathers, or you think they could have handled something better, probably not ideal to wait a whole month later before, you bring it up with them. So thinking about timing is very, very important. Reflection, and this is something I'm going to be talking about a lot throughout the presentation, but reflection is so, so important. I'm going to give a story a little bit later about a time where I received feedback that I didn't necessarily agree with, but if I would have just written it off immediately, then I wouldn't have gotten better. But that reflection really helped me kind of get through that situation. Active listening skills are also really important on both sides. So making sure that they feel heard and understood on the giving side, and just active listening skills to hear what that person is trying to tell you on the receiving side. Qualities of a good conversation, right? You want to be paying attention to that person. You don't want to have those distractions. You want to really be taking in and listening to what they have to say. And then negative versus positive feedback. So a lot of times I think when the word feedback is used, it is used in the negative or constructive feedback kind of vein, but feedback can also be positive too, which is something that I hopefully will be talking about more throughout the presentation. But just when you're thinking about things you want to discuss with your team or your boss or your coworkers, like think about not just how they could grow, but things that they're already doing really well. And then gratitude on both sides, right? When you're giving feedback, expressing gratitude to that person, so because they don't have to listen to you, they can get defensive, they can write you off and say that you don't know what you're talking about. And then gratitude on the receiving side, again, they don't have to give you that feedback to help you learn and grow. They're taking their time to do that because they want to help. So gratitude is also a huge component of feedback on both sides of the conversation. So we covered the foundations of giving and receiving feedback, some steps to do both sides of the conversation, and some considerations that aren't exactly steps, but things you should be thinking about during those conversations. What I now want to do is, if you would like to seek feedback out more, some things that you can do to make that happen. So when you're seeking feedback from others, ask that feedback from someone that you trust, someone who's going to give you an honest opinion, someone who's going to take the time to really give you that feedback that you're asking for. And I have some sample questions that you can ask as well. So do you have any feedback for how I did on that project? This is a question that you can ask your coworkers if you're working in a team, or even your supervisor once you're done with that project. How do you feel like I can improve moving forward? So not necessarily dwelling on the past and what you did wrong, but what steps can you take in the future to help make your performance a little bit better? And then you can also ask for specific information just to get the conversation rolling. So something I'm probably going to ask a few of you after this is, did I talk too fast during that presentation, right? Because sometimes when you start a little bit more specific, then it gives the conversation a good place to start, and then it can go other places. Once you ask that question and they are giving you that feedback, listen without judgment, which is something that we've talked about a lot. And then thank them for being honest. Again, feedback is only as helpful as the honesty of the feedback. So making sure that if it's a mix of negative and positive, if it's all negative, all positive, they still need to be thanked for their time and considerations. Finding your strengths. So I don't know about you all, but for me, I'm kind of garbage at knowing what I'm good at. I think that I'm just doing my job, living my life, doing my thing, right? If I keep my head down and no one gives me positive or negative feedback, like, I'm sure I'm doing fine, right? But there are a couple of situations, and probably even more than those that I'm about to list, where it's important to know what strengths that you have. So for example, when you're going on the job search, you might have an idea of what you're good at, but if you get ideas from other people, like if you ask others for feedback, then you can kind of go into an interview with a testimonial of sorts. Here's what I say I'm good at, but here's what other people say about me, right? But there's also situations at work, I know, and this applies to me personally, I am very new into my current role at the University of Utah, and I was trying to find where I should be in the office, like my niche, right? I was doing the normal job duties, but I wanted to work on something else. I just didn't know what that was, right? So I did this activity and it really helped me out. And I'll kind of share the results after I share this activity. So the first thing that you need to do is identify 3 to 5 people that you trust. This can be friends that have seen you work. This can be coworkers, supervisors, past supervisors, anything like that. But 3 to 5 people that you trust that will give you honest feedback and that really want to help you. You ask them to answer these questions about you, and in my experience, it's better to send these questions over email so that they have time to think about their responses, formulate their responses, everything like that. And if they're busy, it's easier to just get to it later if it's an email as well. What are 3 words that describe me? What is 1 positive word that does not describe me? And this is often a question that you'll get very interesting answers to, because it's a positive word that doesn't describe you instead of just like, what can I improve on? It, in my experience, has forced people to get out of their normal routines of reflection. What sets me apart? And then what problems am I good at solving? So again, I would send these 4 questions via email to those 3 to 5 people that you trust so that they have a chance to think on them and then respond fully. Once all the people have responded that you asked, I would compile the results and notice any common ideas. So for me, what that looked like is I put a huge table together in a Word document and had a column for each person, and I would highlight words that came up across different people that were similar or in a similar vein. Because for me, it's just easier to visualize that. Whatever works best for you, if you want to do a word cloud, if you want to print things out and have it in front of you to get really into what they're saying, whatever works. And then finally, reflect on your thoughts. And this is in 2 parts. So how do you feel about these results? Do you agree with them? Do you disagree with them? Just in general, how does this make you feel? And then is there anything missing, and why might that be? I know when I did this activity recently in regards to my job, I realized that the people that I had asked had only known me during my 2-year program for graduate school. So they didn't really have a complete picture of my skills or experiences, and I felt like some of their responses were very indicative of the time that I knew them and the projects that I worked on for that summer internship, for example. So what I ended up doing is I went back to step one, I identified 3 more people that had known me a little bit longer, and went through the entire process again. Once I had that completed, again, compiling all those results and noting any common ideas, almost everyone said that I was good at problem solving in some fashion or another, right? So I took those responses, I set up a one-on-one meeting with my supervisor that was outside of our normal one-on-one and said, hey, everyone says I'm good at solving problems. What problems can I help you in our office solve? And now I have a couple extra assignments because of that, and she really appreciated that conversation. So when you do this activity, like I said, it can be helpful in a couple different contexts, but I think it's really important to actively seek out others' impressions of you, kind of like what was in the video at the beginning. But sometimes the reality is when you go and seek out feedback from others, you might get feedback that you disagree with. For me, that was during an internship while I was at Purdue, actually. I was trying to get a job at my internship site after graduation, and I asked one of my coworkers, how she would feel about that, if she thought I'd be a good fit. And she told me that she felt like I wasn't friendly enough to work at my internship site, which caught me very off guard. I have been described as my friends as aggressively friendly, so the fact that someone said that I wasn't friendly enough was it kind of knocked my world around, if I'm completely honest with you, and I felt hurt and upset and all sorts of things all at the same time. So I came up with a list of steps to go through. If you get feedback that you disagree with, that'll help you kind of process through that experience, what it means, and things like that. So as it's been a theme overall, reflecting first on the context, on the situation, again, what do they know, what is their intent, all of those things, because understanding where the other person is coming from can be very, very helpful. For me, upon reflection, I realized that the person that gave me this feedback only saw me in the hallways of my internship site instead of when I was working one-on-one with our clients, which is when I kind of turn it on, as it were, right? So once I had realized where that feedback came from, I moved on to the step 2, should I speak up? For me, that wasn't necessarily needed because I figured out where that feedback was coming from. But for others, you might need to gather more information to kind of understand where this feedback is coming from. If it's something that you just completely disagree with, then you might feel like you need to speak up and kind of give the full situation to others. But ultimately, that's a choice for you to decide. And then finally, taking action. If you feel like you need to speak up about the feedback that you received that you disagree with, I would definitely recommend talking to whoever gave you that feedback or whoever else was involved in the situation personally in a one-on-one setting, ideally in person, but again, with COVID-19, that's not always possible. So the best you can do with in-person communication. And exactly kind of following the steps that we were talking about before, describing the situation objectively, giving your feedback, all of those things that we talked about earlier. And then regardless of whether or not you speak up, make changes for yourself. Once I had realized, again, where that feedback came from, I started smiling more in the hallway and I started greeting others. And she had even commented later that I had seemed friendlier since she gave me that feedback. So it kind of all worked out in the end. But it is an ultimate reality of feedback that you might get some that you don't necessarily agree with. And I think these are good steps to help you kind of process through that and still end up with a positive outcome. So all of us knowing ourselves what good feedback looks like on both the giving and receiving side, what to do if you don't have feedback that you agree with necessarily, it's all good for us to know that. But ultimately, the goal is to have a feedback culture at your workplace as well, right? So these are some steps that I think can be very helpful for promoting a feedback culture at work. So the first step to this, and I would say that this is a very important step for any corporation, regardless of whether or not you want to promote that feedback culture or not, is start building safety and trust among the team. A phrase that I like to go back to in regards to this is a psychologically safe work environment. And what I mean by that is a work environment where you feel comfortable, content, you're not always looking over your shoulder, you're not scared to ask anyone for anything, really a place where you're psychologically safe. A way to do that is to get to know each other as far as the teams are concerned and talk about your emotions openly and honestly. How did that client make you feel today? Were you angry? Were you frustrated? Were you annoyed? Are you happy about this win that you just got at work? Really talking about your emotions openly and honestly can help promote that safety and trust that is essential among the team. Balancing the scales is a second step. And what I mean by that is start small, which I know that some of you had said earlier that it was a formalized version of feedback. So this is the informal side of feedback. Provide little positive feedbacks, praise effort of your team, not just ability. So, hey, I noticed that you tried really hard on that project. You did a really good job, even though we didn't get the bid. Or, hey, I saw how hard, like the extra mile you went for this team project. I really appreciate, you looking out for us. Just in casual passing can help build up feedback happening more often in your organization. Kind of leading into the third point, normalize it. Don't wait for special occasions. Don't give all your positive feedback at the end of your banquet. Don't give all your constructive feedback in your weekly one-on-one meetings, right? Just normalize it, do little bits every day, and it'll start to promote that feedback culture. And then finally, demonstrating personal accountability. So everyone at every level should be asking for feedback, from the director down to the entry level and everyone in between. Anyone can improve regardless of your job title. So if it starts at the top and people at the top are asking for feedback on different things, then that's going to help make the entry level people feel more comfortable too. I know that at my current work, my supervisor has asked me for feedback on how our leadership team has handled certain things. And I feel very comfortable because I feel psychologically safe at my current work, giving her feedback on how I think things are going and different things that I feel like they could be doing a little bit differently. So it does take some time to promote this feedback culture, but I think it's an important thing for everybody to get used to doing, because that way we can help all each other learn and grow. So now that we've covered how to give feedback, how to receive feedback, what do you do if you disagree with feedback, and how to promote all of this at work, what are you supposed to do with all this information? You have so much now. So I came up with some action steps to help you kind of ease yourself into that feedback world. I also let myself use one meme during this presentation, and this is it. Thank you, Indiana Jones, for action steps. Seek out feedback on a smaller scale more frequently. So if you're working in a group project, hey, how do you think I can do better on the next project? Or did I talk too fast during this presentation? Just asking for little bits of feedback more frequently can help yourself, especially for those of us that said feedback was terrifying or anxious or anything like that, help you kind of get used to it. Have a conversation with your supervisor or coworkers about how you prefer to receive feedback. So I know for me, if I receive constructive feedback that I wasn't necessarily expecting, then I don't always take that well. So when I started working at my current work, I made sure to tell my supervisor that, so that she would know to have kind of a lead in so I could be in the right headspace. Mind space? Man, it's early in the morning, at least here in Utah, to receive that feedback. Provide more feedback to the coworkers, both positive and negative. So that's what I was saying earlier about just in little snippets, don't wait for special occasions, give feedback to your peers. That way it kind of gets normalized at your place of work. And then remembering the steps of giving and receiving feedback. Be respectful, objectively describe the behavior that you're observing, keep an open mind, state when your boundaries are being crossed, and then gratitude and reflection all around, right? These are kind of the core bits of feedback that I think once you keep those in mind during those conversations, that it'll become a little bit easier for everybody involved. So I like to start my presentations with a single word sum up and end my presentations with a single word sum up. So now that we've talked about all of these things, again, using one word, how do you all feel about feedback now? Go ahead and drop your answers in the chat. Prepared, focused, love that. Lots of confidence. Look at it as a positive, for sure. It can be useful. Supportive, it can be definitely very supportive if given and received properly in the workplace. Lots of people saying that they're prepared again. Doesn't have to be scary, for sure. Awesome. So Feel free to continue to give me your single word sum ups about how you feel about feedback, but I want to be mindful of time and move on to the question and answer section. So if you want to put your questions in the Q&A box, we will do our best to answer those with the time that we have left. So someone asked, what is a good way to respond in situations when you don't have a lot of time to reflect on feedback, such as during a performance review? So I think in those kind of situations, it's kind of tough to just like sit there and take it and you can't reflect and you feel like you have to respond immediately. And those are not great situations, right? And if you feel like you don't have the time that you need to reflect on that before you come back to your supervisor or whoever is providing the performance review, I think just being transparent about that with them can be helpful. So you can say, you're giving me a lot of information that I need time to think on. Can I come back to you in a week or the next day or however much time that you need with how I'm feeling about this and what I feel like I can be doing better or instead of the behavior you're describing? I hope that answers your question. And again, that Q&A box should be in the bar where the chat was. So if you want to put your questions in there, feel free. So someone messaged me privately in the chat box and said, how do you address feedback in a non-open environment or a toxic work environment? I think in that it can be very hard to do so, especially if you're not in that psychologically safe work environment, to feel like you are empowered to respond to that feedback, right? So in that case, I would really take the time to reflect on who's giving you that feedback again in the situation, and then try to address it personally if possible. That way it doesn't get out into the rest of the office, because that does kind of tend to become gossip, which is a whole other situation that we're going to have to deal with as well. So if there's someone on the team that you trust, feel free to seek out advice from them as well if it's in regards to a specific person. But again, I think that one-on-one interaction is the key to a lot of different environments. Someone asks, what if when you don't agree with feedback and you try to tell them and they don't agree with you not agreeing basically with what you have? I mean, sometimes it's not possible to come to the same conclusion or be on the same page, unfortunately. But it's all about how that becomes resolved. Do you agree to disagree on it? Is there something that you both agree that you could do better next time so that this doesn't happen again? It's really about that open conversation. But unfortunately, like I said, you don't always come to a resolve or agree with their disagreement or, back and forth. What's a good way to speak up to a manager supervisor when you disagree with them to avoid conflict? I think that, oh no, it went away. There it is. Sorry, I'm new to question and answer boxes. I think it's all about knowing your manager and supervisor. I know for me, my supervisor is really, she likes being direct. That's a style that works well for her. So when I disagreed with the way something was handling, instead of trying to stress myself out about how to say it perfectly and nicely and all those things, I was just like, I don't know how else to say this. So is it okay if I just like say it directly and we can kind of figure out what it means after? And she was like, yeah, of course. So just kind of being open about my own limitations in regards to the situation kind of set that up. But it's all about knowing your supervisor. If they appreciate indirect communication, if they appreciate, the sandwich method we've all heard about, where it's like positive, constructive, positive, right? But it's definitely, I think, like I said in the presentation, it's important for managers and supervisors to also be asking for and receiving feedback. So don't feel shy in giving them feedback. You could also try it on a smaller scale first and kind of see how it goes. Do you have any ways to remind yourself to give feedback more? I'm awful at giving it and know it would help my staff. So that's something that I think for me, it's easier to give positive feedback than negative feedback because I'm generally a pretty positive person. And it's easier for me to just kind of like let things roll off my shoulders and not deal with it, right? But I think giving yourself little ways to give smaller versions of feedback, whether it be positive or negative, if it's a post-it note, if it's a reminder on your calendar, if it's, whatever works best for you as far as reminders go, starting small, I think, is going to be helpful. So then it becomes part of your routine, and then you kind of grow your mind space for feedback to live somewhere in your head at all times. Can you give an example of feedback that may cross boundaries? For me, I think like if it's completely unwarranted feedback, or if you feel like it's getting a little bit personal, or if you feel like it's more, well, that's kind of a personal example too, but if they're just saying like, I've noticed you're kind of a jerk to our clients, like, what? Like, that's kind of, no, you can't say that, right? So, keep in mind that it's always good if they are crossing boundaries to maybe clarify a little bit. So using the example I gave on, I feel like you've been a jerk to our clients. What do you mean by that? Can you describe a situation in which that happened? Because sometimes it might just be they don't agree with personally how you've been working with clients, or they've heard something. Really getting more information out of the situation can be helpful. But other examples, like I said, if it turns more personal and not objective, or if it gets judgy, or if they're assuming things, then that's kind of where it crosses boundaries, I would imagine. We kind of answered unrequested constructive feedback to a supervisor. Suggestions for working with a supervisor that is afraid of giving negative feedback. How can you go about asking for more constructive criticism? So again, I think for asking for more constructive criticism from a supervisor that's afraid to give the constructive criticism is you can ask for specific feedback in regards to a specific thing. So how do you think I did on that project? Or do you think that I formatted this document correctly? Or something to that effect, so that it's in baby steps and it's about something specific, can be helpful for someone who's afraid to give that constructive feedback. You can also just have an open conversation with them about how you really would appreciate more constructive feedback, and you promise it's not gonna, make you super unhappy and bring you down. Like, you view it as a way to help you grow. Personal preference conversations with supervisors, I almost always encourage, just so that everybody's on the same page. So maybe sharing your thoughts as well as asking for more specific little bits of feedback can help you kind of grow that relationship. I'm going to hop over to the chat box real quick. How do you address a boss who seems like the way to address matters and feedback changes almost daily? And how do you get constructive criticism when the team does not seem to be in a safe environment? So I'm going to take that one question at a time, and thank you for your question. So having a boss that is not consistent in regards to feedback is definitely tough, because you feel like the standards change every day, and one day you're right and one day you're wrong, and that can be very frustrating. So I think kind of going back to what I was saying a little bit ago about having a conversation with your supervisor about how you prefer to receive feedback, whether positive or constructive, I think can be helpful as far as like leveling the playing field goes, right? Because hopefully if there's a supervisor that cares about you and your team and things like that, which might not be the case given the second half of your question, then they'll at least know how to provide you with feedback, and they'll try to do that and match that so that things are a little bit easier for everybody involved. The second half of the question, how do you get constructive criticism when the team does not seem to be in a safe environment? In a psychologically unsafe work environment, I think it's very hard for feedback to exist in any meaningful way, because it seems like all you're getting is negative feedback. You're afraid to speak up. You're afraid to ask for anything because it'll be viewed negatively, right? So again, going back to what I was saying earlier about being open about sharing emotions, being open about getting to know each other, starting to build the trust without the feedback. I think just as a team, the trust within the team is a very important step in that, and also can kind of help with the safety and the trust of the work environment. And then once you have that established, then you can kind of grow up to feedback. It might take some time. It'll be a bit of a process, but psychological safety and trust within the team, I think, even without feedback, is one of the most important things for a successful work environment. How do you provide corrective feedback to coworkers you have a friendship with outside of work? That is always so hard, because it's the line between friend and coworker blurs a lot of times, and you feel like you're being a butt when you're really not, and you're trying to help, and you have these opinions, and it's a whole lot of things and a lot of emotions, right? But if you go back to the steps on giving feedback at the beginning of the presentation, leading with your intent, I think, is a big part of this, right? So as well as timing and location, you don't want to be grabbing a drink with your friend and be like, hey, by the way, I think you could have done this thing better, because your work brain is off and you're in your socializing brain. So that's kind of an awkward time to do it. So if you can find time at work to have that conversation, then definitely I would recommend doing that, as well as leading with your intent, like I was saying. So, hey, I say this as your coworker and someone that wants to see you grow and improve. I've noticed these things, and here's how I think that they might go a little bit differently, or I'm here to help. I've noticed you're struggling with this. So timing, location, and leading with intent, I think, are both three very critical portions to giving feedback to a coworker that you're also friends with outside of work. Any other questions? Feel free to drop them in the Q&A box or the webinar. Any last minute questions, concerns? Going, gone. All right. I have my email and my LinkedIn here. If you want to continue the conversation, or if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, I invite you to do so. But other than that, I'm going to turn it back over to Becca Jones, and thank you all for attending and asking such good questions.
Thanks, Crystal. I know I've definitely learned a lot in this entire process of giving and receiving feedback. I am one of those very awkward people that don't know how to take positive feedback. So just saying thank you is what I'm going to work on. I hope that everyone else picked up something that they're going to start using, little actionable steps. Our webinar will be available on our website, www.tobeconnect.com. Just click events and then choose this event, and the webinar will be right below that here at the end of today. You'll all get a follow-up email with our next webinar, which is actually a social hour, so lunchtime social hour, and we're going to be playing some Jackbox TV. So make sure to sign up for that. It'll all be in your email. Go ahead and log in, register, sign up, and bring your lunch next Tuesday so we can have some fun. Thank you guys for coming, and see you guys next week.